Hello and welcome to Geneva in Switzerland, the city that's the host to what's been called the most significant gathering of world leaders in history. On the agenda, not nuclear weapons or high finance, but everyday issues that between them confront all the Earth's 6 billion people. Work, poverty and inequality. The issues that we've been looking at in life. We began our journey in the globalized world with the carnival in Brazil and one face in the crowd, Geraldo de Souza. Like other workers, he was also taking to the streets in protest against a globalized economy that he believed had cost him his job. In the Philippines, we found those who were unluckier still, young women trying to bring up families on Manila's rubbish heap. 1.3 billion people still live on less than $1 a day. Mexico, workers who are trying to find better paid jobs across the United States border.
See you guys.
We filmed them at the start of their journey, trying to beat the patrols and trying to beat the rules of a global economy which allows capital to cross borders more freely than labour. We followed British doctor Sam Everington to Bangladesh, a country where almost half his patients' families come from.
It's incredible, so many people on the streets. I just hadn't realised it was this poor.
And we went with him into the clinics that treat malnourished children. Their life chances put in jeopardy as soon as they're born. In the streets of Philadelphia, we saw why the Social Summit will be looking at first world poverty too, as workers and activists demand a decent living wage. In Washington, we filmed demonstrators who say globalization is one-sided and has gone too far. Some say their protests could jeopardize the benefits of globalization, but others believe they're drawing attention to issues too often ignored by politicians. Now, it may seem quixotic to suppose the world's statesmen and women can work out common policies to deal with these issues, but that's precisely the agenda of the United Nations Social Summit here in Geneva. The story of this summit began in 1995 in Copenhagen in Denmark, when the United Nations held its first social summit. Its aim to combine globalization and free market economics with social justice. But it was only a partial success. So the idea of Geneva is to review what progress there has been and to recommit the world to those fine but still elusive goals. In the 5 years since Copenhagen, globalization has accelerated, creating both winners and untold numbers of losers, many, though not all of them, in developing countries. To find out what the Third World wants from this summit, I spoke to one of its most eloquent delegates, Faith Innerarity from Jamaica. I asked her what the summit can achieve that economic growth on its own cannot.
It's not, I think, what the summit can achieve that economic growth cannot achieve. Underlining all the discussions that we have had since the summit is the link between economic and social development. Social development cannot take place unless there is economic growth. Economic growth by itself, though, does not ensure social development. There must be deliberate policies which would ensure that the benefits from economic growth are available to all within a population.
Wasn't the commitment to eradicate poverty made at the Social Summit 5 years ago unrealistic?
These are realistic objectives. Realistic from the standpoint that the world is capable of doing this. Let us stop for a moment. Look at what this world has achieved in terms of technological advances. We have advanced telecommunications technology. The world has become a global village as far as communications is concerned. We have made advances in the biological sciences. Look at DNA, what is being done with DNA. Mankind has vast resources, vast potential. Why cannot these potentials be harnessed to address very fundamental issues such as eradicating hunger from the world?
So what do you think should happen now?
Now we are at a crossroads, and this is where the Social Summit has its greatest importance in pointing the world again to the issue of equity, of social justice, of inequality, of the need for each society to provide for every citizen the opportunity to participate in economic life, the opportunity to have access to those goods and services which are essential for a decent quality of life.
Well, inequality is on the Social Summit agenda. Do you believe there are issues which are in danger of being ignored?
One issue which I think is not very often addressed and which many people shy away from is that of values and spiritual values. The world has become extremely materialistic. The profit motive is very strong. Selfishness is on the rise. We have forgotten some very good principles in terms of equity and social justice. We have thrown out the baby with the bathwater.
Skeptics in the West, of course, claim that all this talk about values is just a cover for what the Third World really wants, the First World's cash. Well, some kind of redistribution of wealth both between and within countries is very much on the agenda here in Geneva. There are some who even dream of new systems of international taxation, perhaps a tax on capital flows, leading ultimately to some kind of embryonic world government. You might think that's the kind of talk that will only take place in private, until you meet one of the first world's most persuasive delegates, Eveline Herfkens from the Netherlands.
I think it's really important now that we improve the global governance. We have the global village, still doesn't have a village council. We have a sort of embryonic world governments, where you have the international financial institutions, you have a World Trade Organization, you have the International Labour Organization, which I see as a beginning of a social affairs ministry for worldwide. And we have to make that system work better, increase coherence in that system, and let it work better together as a whole.
You talk about the ILO, the International Labour Organization, being an embryonic social affairs ministry. I mean, that's dynamite in some countries, isn't it? I mean, the Americans, many of your European partners, are not going to want anything that even begins to sound like global government.
Well, I think that there is internationally a growing recognition of the need to make international institutions work better. I don't find it so radical to suggest that.
You see the Social Summit Review as an opportunity to push for increased international cooperation.
Yes.
To a degree that would begin to amount to some kind of global government.
Yeah. I see indeed what was fantastic in Copenhagen at the Social Summit proper is that it was the first social summit where, for instance, the World Bank actively participated and accepted the outcome of the process. A few years after that, only a year ago, also the IMF said, we accept the objectives of the Social Summit being guiding our efforts to wherever we put concessional resources in developing countries. So from that perspective, you see tremendous steps forward in improving the coherence of the international system and the thinking of the international system, because for way too long we have been dividing social development on one hand and the economic, hard-nosed economic issues on the other hand. Finally, there's a recognition internationally that these are absolutely interlinked. And that, so everybody is changing their way of thinking about it, including the International Monetary Funds, which is an institution that sets the parameters for development in many developing countries. So that breakthrough is very important out there in the real world.
Do you think that you've all been upstaged at the Social Summit by the kids at Seattle and Washington?
Not really. No, actually. And I must say that there's a lot of confusion out there. Let me tell you that I find civil society crucial in terms of their impact on getting a social agenda in different countries. There is a problem if the debate starts to be as uneducated as it seems to be among some of the civil society, that trade is bad, the World Bank is bad. In terms of the World Trade Organization, there's a very strong anti-WTO mood out there. What I am absolutely convinced is that in a decent world where you want justice, you need more international rules, not less. Because lack of rules means you've got the jungle out there in which the strongest will win. So undercutting the embryonic parts of this future global governance is not helpful in terms of your social agenda.
Just finally, you obviously have a vision which lies behind what you want to achieve at the Social Summit Review. What is that vision?
That vision is indeed that this globe has become too small. It has become a global village. This village needs a village council. We have to get our act together in order to increase global governance to deal with the issues of globalization.
And by global governance, you mean in 5, 10, 15 years?
Well,
what's at the end of the road?
At the end of the road, if you would have a coherent system working together instead of working against each other, with clear mandates instead of the type of mission creep we see in the system, where governments would speak with one voice instead of saying different things, different places, the effectiveness of the United Nations Development Agenda could be greatly increased.
But you mean the world becomes kind of like the European Union, run from Brussels, and it's New York
I
instead?
hope to do it with less bureaucracy, but yes.
But of course, as all summit goers know, there's a world of difference between global dreams and global realities. In 1995, the world leaders who attended the first social summit drew up a short list of key pledges, from eradicating poverty to full employment and universal education. But since then, most developed countries have actually cut their aid budgets, while many developing countries continue to waste precious resources through inefficient bureaucracies, armed conflict and corruption. So when I spoke to the top United Nations official behind the social summit, Nitin Desai, I asked him whether he's simply creating a stage on which world leaders can make promises they'll never keep.
I hope not, and it's certainly not our intention to do that, and I do not believe that's why they come there. I believe they come there because they believe that they need to get together to reaffirm their commitment to something which is very close to their heart.
But the last set of commitments weren't really kept, were they?
Some of them were. Certainly there's far higher priority being given to poverty eradication now in public policy, in aid policy, in international relations generally, and certainly in domestic policy than what we had in the past.
Isn't it the fact that you are at the mercy, and indeed the world leaders who will be meeting at the summit, are at the mercy of powerful economic forces that you can't control? You don't mention in most of your preparatory material that I've read the role of the transnationals, and many people would say they're more powerful than many of the government leaders who'll be meeting at the summit.
I'd say that it's an important point that you have raised, and in some ways that underpins the need for global cooperation. Because what you're getting now is multinationals which no single government can influence on its own. But taken together, they can. The issue is one government cannot do it on its own because they can always shift production to another place. They can always shift their activities because they operate on a global basis.
Do you ever feel that what the world faces is not a crisis of economics but a crisis of ethics? That in the end, after 2,000 years of Christianity, much longer of some other religions, people don't really care about their neighbours?
I'm afraid that is true, and that is a problem. And I do believe that there is no way in which we can run any type of community without a core of shared values and ethics, which include solidarity and responsibility. Without that, no community can run. It doesn't matter whether you're talking of the world or whether you're talking of a village. Unless there is that core, that we constitute one community, and because we are one community, we have certain obligations of solidarity and responsibility, we'll never get anywhere.
Give me one practical initiative that you like to see.
Well, one, for instance, which has already been launched by the Secretary General, is on girls' education, a crucial strategic factor in social development. A socially developed society, a society which you would deem to be socially progressive, would almost certainly have a reasonably high status for women, and that's closely tied in with education. There are other initiatives which are being discussed in the area of health, on HIV/AIDS, for instance. Again, a relatively new thing. We were not quite as conscious of the scale of the AIDS epidemic in '95 as we are now. There are some specific initiatives which are being contemplated there. There is discussion on issues of microcredit, which is part of this exercise.
Will you be pressing for increasing controls on financial volatility, some kind of regulation of hot money?
I would say that this is being discussed, perhaps not as much in the context of the social summit as in the context of the discussions on the financial architecture, which are going on at Washington and elsewhere. And this is an aspect which is being addressed and which is now more widely accepted, that we need to put, so to speak, some grit in the wheels of the market every now and then in order to make sure that we don't have wild speculative flows of short-term money.
But some people would say this is a Trojan horse. Once you start talking about regulation, you're bound to end up with taxation on an international scale.
Well, firstly, there's no tax authority, so there can't be taxation. Second, the regulation is not international. The regulation is national. It's simply national governments doing certain things, but knowing that certain other governments are also going to do that.
But isn't there a case for taxation, of taxing international flows to help the poor? I mean, it used to be said no taxation without representation. What you've got is representation without taxation.
I would say that anything which, as far as the global system, multilateral associations are concerned, they are associations. And like an association at a local level, they have to work on contributions. If any such money is to be collected, it will have to be collected by national governments and made available to whatever purpose they think is appropriate at cooperatively, if they like, with other countries. But it's not taxation in the strict, it cannot be. The fiscal powers rest with national governments.
Just finally, when it comes to gender issues, when it comes, for example, to the health and education of women, how can you hope that a social summit will do anything about that when these attitudes are deeply embedded in the cultures of many people?
But it is changing. The very fact that this is being discussed is itself a major achievement. And this is another thing that I would stress. For the first time in human history, we really have people from every religion, people with vastly different historical antecedents, tremendous differences in their culture, talking about values, talking about things like women's status in society, about children, about discrimination, about human rights, about equality, about fairness, about justice. And this is a fantastic achievement. It has never happened that people of such diverse persuasions have been brought together. And it's because you're doing that, it's bound to be difficult. But that's precisely why it's worth doing.
Well, the question facing the leaders of over 150 governments here in Geneva is about as difficult as you can get. How to make sure all the Earth's inhabitants benefit from globalization instead of just a few lucky winners. Answers, please, urgently required. Now, this city, Geneva, is of course the hometown of the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who first coined the phrase the social contract, an implicit agreement between government and governed. What's needed now, many believe, is a new social contract between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots, the winners and the losers. That may prove too demanding an ambition, but Geneva may at least produce some promises the world community will try and keep. So we leave you with this wish list from some of the key players at the Social Summit. From Geneva, goodbye.
My hopes are that the review will produce some concrete actions. I think there are plenty of indicators and plenty of goals out there, but let's identify the ones that seem to make the most sense and commit ourselves to trying to move in that direction. For us at UNICEF, it would be all children have a good, decent education. It would mean that all children have a healthy start, and that young people do have an opportunity to realize their full potential.
I would say to all the leadership in the world that we still underestimate the impact of poverty as a global issue, as an issue which affects every one of us, wherever we live. And it would be my hope that we will go beyond the fine statements which are made by our leaders, and that we will try and help in the education of people in our country so that this can be perceived as really the issue for the next millennium.
What we do now is trying to convince governments and civil society and NGOs that it is not only humanitarian, humanitarian in a good sense, but it also makes good economic sense to invest in the poor, to help bring them out of poverty, investing in their health, in their children, and to give them access to the technologies that we have.
We're pushing very hard for the empowerment of the poor because, our vision of poverty reduction is not the philanthropic vision of handouts or hand-downs to the poor. It's much more the sense that poverty reduction only comes when the poor have political power.
We are moving into a moment in which, because of the incredible capacity of international communication, people's voice are going to become more and more important. Make your voice heard. I think that is a fundamental message that I would like to see coming out of the Social Summit.
What we're trying to do as a government is just to say, for goodness sake, let's stop going to international conferences, signing up to wonderful things, going home, all of us, and saying it's business as usual. Let's implement what we promised. Let's get serious. Let's use these targets for all the work of the IMF, the World Bank, all the UN agencies. Let's get all the bilateral programs to collaborate. Let's measure progress year on year. Let's just really go for it.